Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Atlantic Association, it's a pleasure for me, my name is Paul Bril, to welcome you at this online panel discussion about President Joe Biden's first month in office, particularly his first steps as a new player in world affairs. Our time frame is limited, so we have exactly 1 hour. So I'm not going to waste time by giving you an extensive outline of the most pressing issues. You know them. Neither shall I give you a full biography of our 3 eminent panelists. That would easily fill half an hour. So you'll find everything online that you want to know. I'll just quickly introduce them. We are in contact with all the main capitals in the world. To start with Driebergen, the Netherlands. There is Han ten Broeke. Han, are you there? I think Han is still offline. Okay, then let me start with Maastricht. That's a real capital, maybe the most European city of the Netherlands. There we are joined by Roberta Haar, Professor of Foreign Policy Analysis and Transatlantic Relations at the University of Maastricht. And I would say last but not least, but Han ten Broeke is still waiting for us. Last but not least, from, I think, Vermont, the United States, the Green Mountain State. We are joined by Stanley Sloan. He is a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center of the Atlantic Council of the United States. And he was for many years a leading foreign policy expert of the Congressional Research Service. And in that capacity, he was a valuable source for many foreign correspondents, including me. Good to see you again after such a long time.
Good to see you.
Okay. Some of you who participate online have fielded questions, and I'll try to incorporate a number of them in the conversation with the 3 panelists. And in addition, I'll give 1 or 2 persons in the audience here in The Hague, there are 15 of them, all safe distance, the opportunity to ask a question as well. But let me kick off the discussion with a straightforward question. And I'll start far out west with you, Stanley Sloan. If you look at the first steps of the Biden administration in the field of foreign policy, what do we see? Do we see a return to the pre-Trump era? Do we see change, or do we actually see more continuity than many have assumed? What is your response?
I think probably to put this in some historic context, almost 40 years ago, I wrote a study for Congress titled Crisis in the Atlantic Alliance, Origins and Implications. And when the study was published by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the requester wrote, quote, "In the conviction that a healthy alliance relationship remains vital to U.S. interests, I called upon the Congressional Research Service to analyze the sources of differing United States and European approaches to East-West relations and the implications for NATO's future. In the hope that this report will contribute to the current debate, I am respectfully submitting it for publication. Signed, Joseph R. Biden, Jr., Ranking Member, Subcommittee on European Affairs." Okay. Now, to illustrate how some of the issues around transatlantic relations, let me just quote a brief section from that report. Quote, "How serious is the current crisis? A number of analysts argue that NATO has outlived its usefulness. Some contend that its strategy is outdated and irrelevant, but others argue that we're talking ourselves into a bigger crisis than is justified by events. NATO, for those analysts, still represents the best framework possible for preserving East-West peace and internal West European stability." And then I asked, would shock treatment finally convince the Europeans to overcome all of the traditional obstacles to greater unity? How can the shock treatment be applied without guaranteeing European unity on terms that are potentially unfavorable to U.S. interests? Even if the Europeans decided that in principle, they wanted to organize an independent defense in alliance with the United States, could they do it? End of quote. A quote not to argue that everything stays the same, but to contend that we shouldn't exaggerate the degree of change, perhaps. Biden's facing a huge, challenging task dealing with the mess left behind by Trump. But the potential for success of his approach to restoring American leadership and a healthy transatlantic relationship should not be dismissed easily. So that's my somewhat long answer to your question, but to show that we faced these issues before. And in 1982, Biden was addressing them, asked me to take a look at the issue, and I did. And some of what the words that are still in that report ring as familiar today as they were in 1982.
But do you think that the transatlantic relations are the main concern for the Biden administration, let's say in the first period of governing in Washington?
I think that if there isn't any, let's say, one focus that you could pick out from the early actions of the administration, but I think you can identify Biden's goals. Number one, return the United States to good physical and economic well-being, return it to domestic democracy, and also to international responsibility and respectability. And all of that is going to be built on a framework of multilateral cooperation, with the core of that being with American like-minded allies of the United States, which means the European NATO allies and the EU members.
Yeah. What you're actually implying is that the Trump era has not changed so much as some of us think. Is that true?
I think that a lot of the fundamentals are still there. I think that it's still true that it's very difficult to come up with a realistic alternative to NATO that works in some kind of constructive way for the United States. I don't see any outcome of the current debate that would serve our interests better than NATO continuing, with the United States being more predictable and providing leadership, and with the Europeans providing more effort and taking on more responsibility. To my mind, in some ways, that was the question that I was addressing in 1982. It is still a question today and still a challenge, obviously.
All right. Okay, let me turn to Roberta Haar. Roberta, what are you seeing in the first month? Are you seeing change, restoration, or continuity?
First of all, thank you very much for the Atlantic Commission inviting me, and for Paul for posing these questions, and for having me come and attend. I looked at this a little bit what Stanley was looking at, sort of from a yes and no perspective, if we will see change or not. And I think maybe more concretely, I do see a few things that Biden has done that would say yes. And I think tomorrow, when Biden participates in the virtual G7, that he will definitely talk about global economy, rebuilding global economy with partners. And I definitely will talk about addressing the pandemic and climate change. So I think we can already see a very concrete step tomorrow. I also think, and this is already mentioned, that I think that the cabinet picks that Trump has made and that are still being confirmed, I think they really have emphasized a return to internationalism and transatlanticism, these cabinet picks. And definitely I would say that about Jake Sullivan, who is the new national security advisor. And he has written a few things when he's out of the office. Of course, he was involved very much in the Obama administration, but he's written some key things that I reviewed also again today. But he wrote a very nice article in Foreign Affairs entitled "The World After Trump." So of course he's already thinking about how the world will change and what will be different, what will remain the same. But he does talk about reviving this liberal international order that the U.S. put in place after the Second World War, and he doesn't think it is he thinks it's more resilient than a lot of the people who have been very negative or doom doom and gloom talking about it. And he thinks that it is, and I'll quote this, I think is a nice phrase, it's built to last through significant shifts in global politics and economics and strong enough to survive a term of President Trump. And the other thing I think that's also very interesting, that Sullivan has written extensively on the concept of American exceptionalism. He wrote about that in a very long article in the Atlantic. He sort of updates the whole concept of American exceptionalism, which has really been a driving underlying value of American foreign policy. So I think that's also pointing to it. And I also think picks like Tony Blinken for Secretary of State, he has also talked extensively about rebuilding alliances. He also talked about things like confronting China together and the pandemic together with allies. A third thing I would point about is this new initiative that the EU has, this joint communication, this entitled A New EU-US Agenda for Global Change. And the Biden team has been very positive about this initiative. In fact, it has said, quote, it's a substantial alignment with our thinking. So there is actual movement on documents that the EU has created. And of course, this joint communication, if anyone is familiar with it, is about it's sort of a to-do list for Europeans and how they want to work together with Europeans. So I think that's very positive, and that the first steps out are very positive about that. And the fourth thing I would say is this Biden idea, maybe it's also a bit of a McCain idea, maybe that shows their friendship, that Biden has talked about a summit of democracies in relation to facing off growing autocracies of authoritarian countries. So I think these things are very positive about we'll have something new. Now, if we flip the other side and say maybe not, then I think we have to look at the domestic pressure that is within the United States, that is also, let's say, part of the whole reason why Trump was elected, and the diminishing support that we see within the American electorate for the international system that I talked about. These things are very real and will be very much of a hindrance or obstacle for Biden. More concretely, I think that what the EU did at the end of last year during the German presidency to broker this deal at the end of December with China, I think this was a little bit unhappy for the Biden administration. In fact, they didn't like this whole emphasis of strategic autonomy that the Europeans talked about. Biden administration criticized it a little bit. So they wanted to have more of this substantial leverage between democracies with China, and that maybe didn't come out through this, pushing through this agreement with China at the end of the EU presidency, Germany's EU presidency. Maybe another concrete thing is the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. America's not very happy with that either. They are trying to force more sanctions through this. They're not really happy with Germany doing this. And maybe just to reiterate what Stanley was saying, I think in general, there has been an overall decline in the U.S. willing to be a leader on the global stage, willing to uphold the institutions that it built after the Second World War. And this is certainly something that predates Trump. It certainly was there through when Trump was there. I certainly think Trump accelerated that sort of emotions or exacerbated those emotions, but it still will be there after Trump leaves. So those are my points.
All right. Thank you so far. Let me turn to Han ten Broeke. Han, I already told the audience that you are joining us from the well-known world city of Driebergen.
Munich, actually.
Among many things, you are a former member of the Dutch House of Representatives, spokesman on foreign affairs and defense for the Liberal Party, VVD. Same question to you. What have you seen so far in the first month of the Biden administration in the field of foreign policy? Have you seen change, restoration, or continuity?
I think the best thing we've seen so far is that I haven't been looking at my Twitter for about a month or so. And that's such a relief. It's such a relief not to be a recipient of Twitter messages from the American president, and seeing an American president that does diplomacy by Twitter. Well, he didn't do much diplomacy, obviously, but I think from that angle, there's a bit of restoration. I mean, but if you ask me, what's the most important thing that I've seen? we've seen a foreign policy speech, obviously, by the American president. Very interesting speech. But I think the jury is still out. It's too early to already debate what is the most consequential step. That's too early. It's too early to say, early to tell. But there is a thing that I think we're all looking for or looking at, and that is actually China. China is the only thing that we should be debating right now. And in my opinion, the Biden administration, and you also see in the team that's being picked, we will see more of, maybe not the same, but we will certainly see a firm position by the United States on China. And what I would hope, and maybe the town hall meeting yesterday, I believe it was in Nebraska or so, is that it will be a balanced, non-ideological approach. For the US, as for the EU, there's actually no alternative to some form of coexistence with China. I mean, what we've seen, of course, is a military buildup. We see provocative maneuvers in the South China Sea, the increasingly repressive policies towards Uyghurs in the province of Xinjiang. Immediately in the beginning of the Biden administration, or even before the Biden administration took office, we've seen a crackdown in Hong Kong. I think the previous speaker already mentioned what the Europeans did with the investment deal. I'm not so much one who immediately criticizes Europe on that, because I think we should not play second fiddle, and we've been debating this for seven years now. It is obvious that we should also make our own strategic, autonomous, if you want, decisions on an investment deal like that. But to me, what is important is that in this China-US rivalry, what we should have from the American administration, and what we should play into as European countries, is that we're not becoming the battleground for this rivalry. Therefore, we should find a new form of alignment with the United States on trade towards China. Remember that during the election period, Biden was trying to coin the phrase "a foreign policy for the middle class." Now, what is a foreign policy for the middle class? Basically, if it at all exists, then that is all about changing rules of the international trade so that they benefit your own GDP. This cannot be done by the Americans alone. I mean, Trump's only achievement vis-a-vis China was some kind of a bad trade deal that has to go into a second round, where China pledged somewhere about $200 billion worth of soya beans, and this is not helping us a lot. Neither will going alone by European countries will help us a lot. So we need to find some kind of a new alignment, and this new alignment cannot be a restoration. Maybe it needs a reset, but it needs a new approach with a more with a Europe that is more self-aware and is willing to find a new alignment with the United States.
All right, Stan Sloan, do you agree that China is the number one issue for the Biden administration?
Yeah, it certainly is one of the most difficult issues, and I would like to address that, because there will be a good bit of continuity in American policy toward China, but some change as well. There's not going to be any love fest between Biden and Xi Jinping, but there will be dialogue, and that's already begun. Biden has spent hours talking with Xi in the past, but he neither admires nor wants to emulate Xi. What I expect now, and it's not just, I don't like to see this as a conflict between the United States and China in which the European Union members could get caught in between. There's that danger. But I want to suggest that the Biden administration is going to look to try to come up with some kind of common position in approaching China inside NATO, probably, because the beginning of that was made in London. And I expect the Biden administration to continue that attempt. And to my mind, the type of approach that the Biden administration will take itself toward China is one of recognizing that there are areas of cooperation where it's in the interests of both China and the United States. And there obviously are cases of competition and even conflict. And I would argue that that is also true for most European countries, even if some of the areas of conflict may not be fully recognized yet. They are there. And certainly in the cyber world and in the Arctic, there are areas where I think Europeans are catching on to the fact that there are challenges posed by China. To my mind, the approach the Biden administration should take in dealing with this with its European allies is something like the Harmel approach that we used toward the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The Harmel approach recognized that in dealing with the Soviet Union, and now it could with China, that there are areas in which we have to defend our interests and we have to deter actions that would not serve our interests. But we also have to dialogue and cooperate. And I think if we could come up with something like that as an alliance approach, it would help keep Europe from being in between in a conflict between the United States and China, and in fact, put the United States and the European countries basically on the same side in dealing with China in a balanced way.
Okay. Roberta Haar, do you think that the European countries are willing to form an alignment with the United States vis-à-vis China with a clear position in the field of aggressive strategy, human rights, whatever? What do you think?
Well, if they do, they could certainly be a force multiplier, right? I think China is like Russia in that regard, that they want to divide. Maybe divide and conquer is too strong a word, but certainly divide their adversary, not their enemies, but their opposition in ways that are more convenient for China. But I do think the original question the question that we asked was, is there continuity with Trump's policy towards China and Biden's policy? And I think there are several indications of that. And the first one already came the month after the election in the first week of December 2020, when Biden said very clearly that he will not hurry up with removing the tariffs in the trade war that Trump had with China. And then I think also is very strong indication in the confirmation hearings for Secretary of State Tony Blinken, when he was asked about Mike Pompeo's last parting shot at China, that it was genocide that was taking place in China. And Tony Blinken said, yes, my judgment is that it's true, that it hasn't changed. So the fact that's a very strong word to say that China is committing genocide. And that's why Pompeo probably wasn't brave enough to say it earlier on in the administration and said it as he left the office. But the fact that now Tony Blinken says, yes, coming into office, I agree to that. That definitely says we're going to have a different attitude towards China coming in, or we're going to remain very, very strong on the Chinese policy. The other thing I think is interesting is, of course, it took a long time. Stanley talked about the phone calls that Biden had with Xi Jinping, but it did take quite a while for Biden to call him after he was elected president. And in that phone call, he definitely emphasized and criticized China's unfair economic practices. So I think that's very clear he's going to take a hard line against perceived or real practices that China has economically. And maybe another interesting thing, or something that many people were unhappy about Obama, was the number of freedom of navigation operations that Obama had in the South China Sea, which, of course, there's a lot of activity that China is doing in that area. And Obama had sort of decreased that, or had still done that, but not quite as much. And Trump had increased or heightened the number of freedom of navigation operations there. And just now, this month, on the 5th of February, the USS John McCain conducted the first South China Sea freedom of navigation operation. And this then provides, I think, an early indication that we will now have, like Trump, Biden will follow, and they'll have more frequent and more heightened patrols of the South China Sea. So I think all those are indications that there is continuity to what Trump did in his relations with China, and that maybe even in some ways pointing out that he won't like Xi Jinping, that he'll be tougher on Xi Jinping than even Trump. And will the Europeans go along? Well, wouldn't that be nice if they would have some sort of commonality in relations with China, and then it could be a force multiplier?
Okay, now that we're discussing China, let me turn to a question that was submitted by one of the participants online, retired flag officer P.C. Kok. And he asked the question, he referred to the publication by the Atlantic Council titled The Longer Telegram. I hope that you have seen it or read it. And the question is, do you share the Council's opinion that this document is comparable as important as the famous long telegram that was written by George Kennan in 1946? And do you share the analysis and the strategy, the suggested strategy in this document for the next many years or even decades to steer away from appeasement and to clearly block Chinese aggressive strategy, which aims at, let's say, changing the based world order according to the views in Beijing. So, what is your opinion about this analysis? Han ten Broeke, maybe first.
I haven't read that last long telegram, to be honest. Was it signed by X as well, or?
It was signed by an unknown high official.
Well, when it hit the desk at the time, I believe 70 years ago, of course, it made a lot of foreign analysts made the world different. I don't know about that, so I can't comment on the specific question from Mr. P.C. Kok. Let me just say this: we should avoid some kind of a ideological rivalry that we've seen in the Cold War days. I mean, that is not how I see this century of China-US, Sino-US rivalry, preferentially not with Europe being a battleground in between, how I see that come about. But we also have to admit that after Trump, and I think that is also a question that is on the table now, after the presidency that we've seen, things cannot just go back the way they were. The return to pre-Trump status quo, in my opinion, is not only not going to happen, it is also not desirable. The days of America as a hegemony in this age of China rivalry, we have to see that into a different light. So I don't think that a long telegram in terms of a new Cold War, announcing a new Cold War era, is going to be a justifiable analogy. But then again, maybe I have to read the article first, and when it's written by a high-ranking military officer, then obviously I will do that. It's interesting enough.
How about you, Stan Sloan? Have you read it?
I have to admit I have not. I've been very busy the last 4 weeks teaching my students at Middlebury College something about Euro-Atlantic relations, and now I'm grading their final paper. So I have not. There are a lot of things I haven't read in the last several weeks. But let me say something in response to the comment that Tom Den Broek, sorry, no ability to pronounce Dutch words, sorry. That even in spite of my long years of contacts, that's one thing I haven't learned with all of my good Dutch friends. Some of the names I can pronounce, some I can't.
Isn't the easiest name?
The question of hegemony, the Biden administration certainly doesn't aspire to that. That went by the boards a long time ago. I think the term is used more with people who want to criticize the United States and its form of leadership. And certainly when Trump led with a strongly unilateralist approach, that can be viewed as hegemonic. That's not at all what the Biden administration is seeking. It's seeking, when it says leadership, it means cooperating with allies. It means compromising. Biden has said many times that there's nothing but compromise is not a dirty word. And he means that both in a domestic context where he has a lot of experience in getting things done by compromising, and he means it in an international context. But he also stands firm behind the values that actually are articulated in the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty in supporting democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. That doesn't mean we come out with an ideological campaign against China, but it does mean working with the allies to try to support those principles and the liberal political system, democracies that are implied by those values in the North Atlantic Treaty.
Yeah, but the need for compromise does not exclude the fact that maybe we are dealing with a geopolitical challenge, and recognizing that may be important. Isn't that true?
Exactly true. There's no question about it. There is a geopolitical challenge there. And the United States, I think, has recognized it, perhaps more than many European countries.
Yeah, right.
And that will require some movement by some of our European allies. And at some point, I'd like to say something about strategic autonomy, but that's
okay. Well,
let's have it.
You'll get your chance. Roberta Haar, isn't it true that especially European countries find it difficult to recognize let's say, a geopolitical challenge and to see aggression where it exists? Is that true? Or do you agree?
I'm not sure if I agree with that. I think that if they are certainly partners with the NATO alliance because there was a direct challenge, and that's also what the long telegram is originally about, right? It's about the Soviet threat and understanding the true nature of what a Soviet Union is, and therefore we need to do something about that. And what I was thinking about, because I have not also read this article about the longer telegram, and I do agree with Han that we should avoid setting up some sort of ideological rivalry. But maybe the main point of all this is that we need a new grand strategy. We need some sort of cohering underlying basis and rationale for what the U.S. is doing or what it's doing with its partnerships. And I think that's what's missing here, right? That's what you had with the long telegram. It's about containment. It's about rivaling the Soviet Union that has one set of values and ideologies, and we have a different set of values. And this is also a little bit what Jake Sullivan wrote in this article that I talked about the Atlantic about American exceptionalism. He's also writing about that the U.S. needs a new grand strategy, and that we were always a little bit wrong when we said that U.S. grand strategy was only political or value-based. It's also economic. And he's talking about the economic aspects and what Han has already brought up, this whole idea that we need to have a foreign policy that helps the middle classes. So if you understand the economics of in the past that the U.S. Had free trade because it didn't have colonies and it wanted to open up the trading system so it could trade. That's a political economic policy. Or in the Cold War, it had a policy of growth or making the interior of America strong or the West strong so it could rival the Soviet Union. But now, if we have an economic policy that drives America, it should be something about fairness and equality and the middle class, and maybe making globalization work for everyone and not for only some part or the elites of the population. So I think that's what we need. Maybe the longer telegram can address that as a new raison d'etre or a new underlying meaning or strategy for the West that allows it to go forward and coherence of how they're going to meet challenges of the future together.
All right. Let me open it up to the audience here in The Hague. Can I please state your name, and do we need a microphone, or there's a microphone on the way?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Michel Kekkers, NRC Handelsblad. I have a question for the three panelists on the China strategy. it's great to talk about grand strategy and values. So I can see how the US and Europe can cooperate in, I don't know, if it comes to the Uyghurs or to Hong Kong, but they both have their own economic interests and they will from time to time diverge. I mean, the US and Europe have, even apart from China, have conflicting economic interests. So how much can you combine there if you want to have a grand strategy? How do you make sure that the both powers will have enough leeway to follow their own economic interests?
Okay, Hunter Broeke, will you go first?
Sure. A good question. I mean, first and foremost, we can only align our interest if the parts of the sum will do whatever is needed to actually be able to align at the same level. So the United States has never in its past, they've always been able and willing to put their geopolitical interests first and also back it up, for example, with military might. For Europe, that is not an alternative at the moment. So whenever we talk, and this is a lot of talk, of course, in Brussels, also in The Hague, and other European capitals, is we're all talking about this notion of strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy. The reason why I'm not so fond of that term, and especially not of autonomy, is that it alludes to a Europe that has that would be able to come up with its own hard power assets. We don't have that. We will never have it. We don't have the ability nor the inclination to get there. We will always have an interest in having American hard power at our continent, whereas at the same time, for example, in the region around Europe, we also have to say to the United States, we can do part of that ourselves. We're willing to do part of that ourselves. That's not just a matter of bringing more cash to the defense budgets. It is also a question of putting in the willpower to defend our external borders, to do something in anti-ballistic missile defense, and all these things that bring a lot of challenges to European governments at the moment. So if we want to align our interest vis-a-vis China and not become this battleground of a China-US rivalry, then Europe has to quickly not just define what is our strategic, what are our strategic interests, but we have to put the money where our mouth is. We have to, of course, increase our defense budgets. We have to take care of our own external border policies. I mean, basically, I've said this many times, and you probably know that, but foreign policy, European foreign policy, if ever it would exist, it should maybe first start with foreign border policies, regional policies. We have to do more in terms of our NATO commitment. So what I just said, the missile defense, for example. If we can do that, then we can align our interests. If we're not going to align our interests, then we will be the Sancho Pancho to the Don Quixote of former Western, the liberal order. So I would like to see a more balanced relationship between the EU and the United States, other countries, obviously, Canada, Australia. We all have more or less the same skin in the game, but we're not willing to put up what is needed in order to face that rivalry.
Okay, Stanislaw, this is your chance to say something about strategic autonomy.
And I will. I think organizations should never set objectives that they're bound to fail in fulfilling, and And the idea of a Western grand strategy for dealing with everything is an objective that I think setting it would lead to failure. And so it's not the way to go. The alliance will be trying to prepare a new strategic concept, and that is a level of agreement inside the alliance that is good. It doesn't handle, obviously, all of the issues in the U.S.-European relationship or the U.S.-European approach to the rest of the world. On strategic autonomy, the terminology is just bad. It gets in the way of effective communications between the United States and Europe. And it's, as Han just pointed out, it's unrealistic in terms of the near-term prospects for Europe. I would recommend that Europeans move from talking about European strategic autonomy to European strategic identity. I think that's something that is reasonable and realistic for Europe to try to define its strategic outlook in common to the extent possible. But then I think if you look at what Biden is saying our approach is, obviously we're going to defend U.S. interests, but one of the key U.S. interests in our administration is working with allies to achieve our objectives. That we're already in a different place than we were in a few years ago. But the terminology strategic autonomy, I think, tends to get in the way of dialogue and effective cooperation. I heard in another meeting a couple of days ago, I heard an American say, and this may be said by more than one person, but I thought it sounded like a good objective for Europe, and that is for Europe to become the responder, the first responder in its own area. In other words, to set the goal of being able to respond to most security challenges in its neighborhood. And for the United States to be certainly there and available should the task become too large for European capabilities to be able to step in and support. I think that's not an unreasonable objective for a European identity, a strategic identity in the near term. Even that will be difficult. We know, as Han said, the defense spending has to increase. That's a difficult challenge right now, given how the pandemic has affected budgets, national budgets, and how it will continue to have an impact. But that is, unfortunately, if the Europeans are going to defend their interests and be an effective ally for the United States, they need to do more. They need to take more responsibility for security in the European area.
Yeah, but even for the task of being a first responder, Europe still has a long way to go. Isn't that true, Robert Tahar?
Especially if it's on the Ukraine issue or on the borders of Europe, that could be difficult for them to respond to.
Or
that.
Libya.
But maybe you asked the question about following separate economic interests, and maybe Europe and the US do have some competition, especially in the automotive area. But I do agree that instead of focusing on the differences they might have, is to focus on those things that they are in alignment with. And there are many things, especially if we look at Chinese espionage. It's a serious cybersecurity threat. It now has more hackers than Russia has. And of course, Russia, we know, has recently had this big intervention in US cyber areas. But recently there was over 160 interventions by Chinese espionage workers in 20 different countries in the North Atlantic area. So they really are upping their game as far as snooping around and what's happening in the cyber world. But they're doing even things like threatening with keeping nationals. This is a thing that I think only just recently happened in the last few days. I saw something that the new Secretary of State talked about, that they are detaining for political reasons foreign nationals and dual citizens in China and charging them with espionage, charging them with under national security laws. So they're really trying to use the leverage by detaining people. So this is bad for Europeans as well as Americans. So they could come to some sort of agreement. There's now Canada's come out with this new law that now over 58 countries have signed, and China's pushing back on it. But I mean, this is an interest that everyone has, that China has stopped detaining their foreign nationals and using them as some sort of political leverage. Also, they're trying to use rare earth minerals as political leverage. They've already said they're going to limit supplies to the US on rare earth minerals because these things are critical to the defense industry. So China's trying to play hardball in very specific ways, and these things hurt Europeans as much as they hurt Americans. So why not align with Americans to address these issues? Or what things that are going on in Hong Kong? I mean, maybe I think the Europeans also have an interest, or what's happening with the Uyghurs. All these things are common, and if they align their interests instead of focusing on the things that divide them, they're more likely to get results.
Okay, another question? Go ahead. The microphone is coming.
Yeah. My name is Jan van Bentem, foreign commentator in Nederlands Dagblad. One issue, what we here notice of changed geopolitics is that we don't talk about Russia. But Russia and China very strongly cooperate in undermining the liberal international order. They even have an agreement on that, signed and re-signed by the Russian and Chinese president. And now Russia has stated last week that when we Western countries talk about human rights and these kind of things, we are to stay away. We should not come to Moscow anymore. They don't want to talk about that. Just skip contacts. Minimalize to the bare minimum is what Fyodor Lukyanov of the Valdai Club wrote, and he always introduces President Putin every year when he announces his newest policies. So if China and Russia work together in this issue, and this is an ideological issue, how should we do that? Because we're looking at aligning our interests, etc. But the main interest of the democratic international order is that we cooperate to defend it. How to do that if they want to cut off all contacts on this issue?
All right. Hand ten Broeke?
Well, the first thing that springs to my mind is that when Jan said skip all contacts, if only Mr. Borrell would have kept to that a week ago. I mean, that would have saved us with quite some trouble. This is not a world, I think, that is. Let me start differently. I think the undermining of the liberal world order we've now seen for quite some years, and unfortunately, not just from the unliberal world. I think Trump did a lot to undermine not just US credibility on the world stage, but he questioned the value of alliances, of treaties, multilateralism, basically also renegated his international commitments, made incredible threats to NATO, to EU, didn't follow through, thank God, on all of them. So part of that erosion of the liberal world order has also come from our own friends and is also taking place at our own continent. So in what place are we to still lecture the rest of the world on that? To a certain extent, I can actually also see the leeway that Moscow feels it has to sort of vet their visitors program. At the same time, Russia is not in a position to simply call the shots on the agenda of the communication with Europe. If Europe is self-aware enough, and this is what the Borrell visit, or the press conference that we have all seen with our toes in a nasty position. This is what the Borrell visit proved, that if we can actually be more self-conscious, and then it is not impossible, even in a more mercantile world that we currently live in, to still project onto our adversaries, including Russia, the cost of them eroding a liberal world order. That doesn't mean that we can reinstall the damage that's been done. We need to work on that. But I'm not one who says that it is impossible to have a more self-confident EU foreign policy, even in Moscow. Because at the end of the day, the gas is streaming in one way, and then our euros are streaming the other way. So it also gives us leverage in terms of the Russia-China relationship.
Okay. In order to save time, I won't make the full round again. So another question.
Thank you. René Cuperus, Klingendaal International Institute. I want to thank the panelists first for their clear presentations. Thank you very much for that. My point is, we are maybe underestimating the Donald Trump shock in Europe. This has released enormous anti-American ghosts and spirits. I'm very much concerned about the public opinion in Europe, especially in Germany, especially under the younger generations. There you see a total pacifist, neutral position. Again, they feel closer sometimes to see China or Putin's Russia than to America. The whole concept of the West is lost, more or less, in the younger generations in Europe. So what's missing, what's lacking at the moment, I think, is stretching out hands. I don't see stretching out hands in the transatlantic relations. And we need very strong signals, I think, to restore the concept of the West, which we need very much in an Asian or Chinese century.
And you mean stretching out hands from Europe to...
From both sides.
Both sides. Okay, Robert de Haar, do you agree with this view?
Well, I do understand this fear in Europe. So you have Trump there, and you had 74 million Americans who voted for him, and even though there seems to be very much a culpability of Trump inciting them to have an insurgency and attack another branch of government, he still seems to be very, very powerful. So if you know that, then you might ask yourself, if you're European, is Trump the exception? Will he or someone like him run again in 2024? I think that's the real question. And you see I was watching some of the films that they showed in the impeachment, and you think, well, what is happening in America? Is this our partner? If I'm a European, should I seek a new hedging ally? Should I start to be more friendly with Russia or with China because they're the emerging powers? Is that what they should do? And I see their real doubts. Now, I think that's exactly what Biden is trying to do when he addresses, we're back, we're an aberration. I think that Trump is an aberration, but I think that Senators Elizabeth Warren and Senator Bernie Sanders agreed more with Trump, that America's role on the world stage is in decline, that we should show more restraint, and that we should handle the world differently, and which is more like Trump than Biden is himself. And I finished, I read a column also for Elsevier Weekblad, and I finished one on Monday and I sent it off. And I was basically addressing this issue. What sort of foreign policy can we expect from Biden in the future? Will he be like Hillary Clinton or Samantha Power, some of these more liberal internationalists, interventionists, or will he be more like, will he be more reticent, more with a shield, a little bit more like Trump? And I think it's a wait and see. And I think he has aspects of both that he evidenced in the past. But of course he is, and maybe this is something we could take comfort in the last few moments, he is a very well, he has very much experience. He's very knowledgeable in the area of foreign policy and security policy. Of course, he is vice president for 2 terms. He is the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has been to more Munich security conferences than any other president. So we can hope that he has an understanding of foreign policy, and the positives that we talked about today here, he can build upon those rather than the negatives that we've also talked about.
Okay, Hans ten Broeke, do you agree that there is a sort of a fundamental political climate change in the Atlantic world that cannot be easily overcome? Maybe not so much among the political class, as well among, let's say, the population at large.
I do, and I also see the point that René Cuperus was just making when we talk about new generations. I mean, that what we've so far only seen in Germany. There's this fundamental anti-American attitude that has been given, of course, some new energy. I mean, Biden vowed to restore, of course, the U.S. as a what have you, resolute and dependable power. And the question is, can that actually be done? Because there is a lot of damage. I don't know whether that's beyond repair or not, but I don't believe, as I said before, so much in restoration of things. Maybe a reset, that's what we're after, of course. I do know that the damage that's been done in this transatlantic relationship is long-lasting, and we need a lot to invest in it. I mean, I think it was Joseph Nye who said just recently, there is absolutely no certainty for Europeans that the US could not produce a new Trump, maybe even under the same name. I mean, let's face it, the 2020 elections were no repudiation of Trumpism. If it's Trump, we have to see. But foreign policies that we are used to, the US foreign policy that we were used to, I don't think that can be restored simply because foreign policies don't accept voids or vacuums. I mean, Syria policy, the retreat from Syria cannot be undone, cannot be unmade. The Shia axis that is now there, it cannot be undone. And it is a European reality more than an American reality, maybe so. EU trust is now conditional, has become conditional, and that's not just for Germany or other countries that have had a more critical relationship with the US. That's also for the Netherlands, for example. So yes, reset, we need that. Let's not look back too long. Because maybe we needed Trump in order to grow up ourselves here in Europe. I mean, that's what I hope.
All right. And there is time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Carlijn Jans. It's interesting to note that the Middle East is absolutely absent from this conversation. I thought it was very interesting.
What is absent?
The Middle East.
Yes.
And also, I think it was only yesterday that Biden made a phone call to Netanyahu. And I was wondering if the panel could reflect on where the Middle East policy for the Biden administration stands, but also what that means for allies and their burden sharing in the region.
Okay. Stan Sloan, will you start off, please?
I'd like to go back to some of the previous questions where I had a lot to say. Middle East, I think, is still a little bit up in the air. I think the Biden administration will try to pursue a sort of a balanced approach. We've yet to see all of this deployed because there's a lot to be said still about the relationship with Iran and how that will impact on relations with Israel and the Saudis. I think there's a lot up in the air, so it's a great question. Since our time is getting short, I wanted to say a couple of things. First, about Russia and China. My main point about them is we should avoid forcing them together because they both want to replace the liberal international system with their own model. And we should avoid doing anything as the West. And I wrote a book published last year called Defense of the West. So I'm kind of sensitive about how we defend the West. And one way we do it is not by pushing them together. My final point is on the domestic question. The United States and European countries both have faced the problems of radical right populist movements. There are some that are still definitely in charge in Europe, and they're not in the United States because Trump was defeated by 7 million votes. We're working, and the Biden administration, why I pointed out at the beginning of Biden's foreign policy to understand it, is he's going to rebuild the American health and the American economy and the American democracy. And then that combines with reestablishing American leadership. And Europeans have to do this too. We have to demonstrate that liberal democracy works and is effective in dealing with the real and legitimate needs of people. This is where we can rebuild the strength of the West. And this is something that Europeans have to contribute to as well as Americans. And I'll stop at that.
Okay. Robert Haar, going back to the Middle East, is that still an area of great concern for both America and Europe?
Yes, I think so. And I think I did have some notes because we thought we might talk about the JCPOA, which of course Biden has said that he wants to reinvigorate without any preconditions. re-enter. But of course, others in his administration would like to have something more about the missiles that Iran has been developing. But I will say there have been some positives on the Trump administration within the Middle East, as, for example, the Abraham Accords, which was the U.S. helped broker between Israel and the Abu Dhabi, the UAE. So they are going forward a little bit, and maybe these are things that the Biden administration can capitalize on, that there is a better relationship between Israel and some of the Arab countries. But of course, the reason why there's more coherence between Israel and the Arab countries is because they are also sort of offsetting Iran, and which is going to be the interesting conundrum, also including Yemen, where Iran is also involved. This will be the conundrum, how to deal with this group between the Iran and the Saudis, or those are against them. And I think there's a lot of room for failure. The U.S. policy in the Middle East has not been very positive. We've already mentioned several failures already, but maybe he could build on those things that have been positive. Although I did read an article and Caroline talked about the phone call that Biden had with Netanyahu. I have read that the confrontation between Biden and Netanyahu is very much inevitable. So we can expect things to be difficult there.
Okay, Hans ten Broeke, do you think that the Biden administration is willing to spend political capital on the Middle East, or should it?
It depends on what your definition of the Middle East is. I don't think they will spend a lot of capital on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict at the moment. There's simply not much to do there. I think the Biden administration is right to pursue the policy, maybe the only successful foreign policy of the Trump administration on the Abraham Accords, although I do feel that is certainly overlooked here in our part of Europe, the contribution that Benjamin Netanyahu made to these Abraham Accords himself. That is a consistent foreign policy on his side for the last 6 to 7 years. I mean, the historical importance sometimes escapes Europeans, but it has basically, essentially brought an end to the 3 no's of Khartoum. And I think that changes a little bit the balance in the Arab world. What I'm very happy with is that the totally unhinged Trump policies that were basically the Middle East policy as far as it was offshore to Riyadh, that seems to be changing. Yemen was already mentioned. A more balance between, I mean, Americans have always been eager to not disturb too much the balance between Sunni and Shia. And from that, of course, follows that we need a new JCPOA. Would be great if, I mean, I've always been critical about that deal, but tearing up the deal as Trump did has only increased tensions in the region. And currently we face in Iran that is, again, more or less at the same kind of enrichment levels as we've seen before we've actually entered into negotiations. So have to sort of back to the future on that side. So I think Iran, Yemen will get priority. Unfortunately, I don't see an immediate peace breaking out between Palestine or future Palestine and Israel, but who knows?
All right. Well, there are many more questions to be asked, but time is up. So let me thank the panelists, Hans ten Broeke, Stan Sloan, Roberta Har, for sharing their knowledge and insight. Thank you very much. I apologize to our online participants for not asking all the questions that were submitted. I can only point to a Winston Churchill quote who said, "It's a mistake to look too far ahead. The chain of destiny can only be grasped one link at a time." So that means that we will have another online panel discussion in maybe a few weeks. Thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, colleagues.
All right.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.